All right, yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Jaron Bradley. Super excited to be here, Shaka Khan. If you're like me, you'll take any excuse you can to have work send you out to Hawaii for a little while. I spent some time living on Big Island, actually. I absolutely love it out here. Love the islands. Love coming to visit. So if you get time, I'd highly recommend going over to Hilo, checking it out, one of my favorite little towns. Despite what the media would have you believe, it's not buried under 100 foot of lava. Yet. Anyway, I want to bring you a presentation today called Macdoored. This is essentially, over the past few years, we've seen a lot of presentations on what attackers are doing on Windows systems once they manage to break in and move laterally and go about Windows intrusions. But that same activity hasn't really come to light for Mac. In the past few years, we've seen a lot of new backdoors for Mac, and a lot of researchers finding those and releasing details on those, which is absolutely awesome. And the same goes for vulnerabilities, which is super cool. But the hands-on activity that the actor is actually performing remains a little bit of a mystery. So I was hoping to shed just a little bit of light on that today, and hopefully you're able to take something away from it. So just a little bit more about myself. I started my career as an incident responder, and eventually saw this whole endpoint thing that was coming out and wanted to get involved in that space. So I jumped over to CrowdStrike, where I've been almost for 5 years now. So around the time CrowdStrike was collecting data and they needed new analysts to go through that data and find malicious activity, that's about the time I came around. I've jumped around internally a little bit, done detections engineering at the endpoint level, primarily looking at Mac OS detections and how we can find malicious activity on Apple systems. And now I work on a research team called the SCAR team, where we build new detections as well as new ways to enable those detections. I'm also an author of OS X incident response scripting and analysis. Funny story, I worked on this book probably for about a year, and then it was probably about 3 weeks after it came out, Apple officially announced they'd be renaming their operating system from OS X to Mac OS. So within 3 weeks of my book coming out, the title was already outdated. But a lot of the content within it is still relevant. If you like what you see today, a lot of it talks to some of the attack techniques you'll see today. So a quick Mac basic hunting overview before I get into the details. One thing we really like to hunt on and use is process trees for our hunting process. So essentially a process tree gives you context into an event or a detection that occurred. So let's say that you have an event that gets thrown to you when somebody modifies the sudoers file. The sudoers file being one of the components that allows a user to escalate to root by using the pseudo binary. If your name is in here or whatever, you're able to use that. So here we have two different cases where that happened. The first is where that occurred under JAMF in the process tree. JAMF is third-party administrative software. If you've managed a group of Mac laptops before, or you work in IT, you might be familiar with it. It's pretty popular. This isn't that suspicious, right? It's probably the flow of an admin coming into a system and modifying the sudoers file most likely at a user's request. The second process tree, on the other hand, much more suspicious. Up the tree is a binary just labeled A sitting in the temp directory. And this looks far more suspicious. If you've done incident response before, you know that single letter executables are never a great thing you want to see. Usually warrants more investigation. But the fact that it's running from temp is also fairly suspicious. So this just gives an idea of how you can take the process tree and give some context around events that have occurred. And you'll see a handful of process trees, screenshots of process trees in my presentation. So I just wanted to cover that very briefly. And then finally, before we get into the attack stuff, detection and analysis difficulties on Mac. Mac is not the easiest platform to write detections for. One of the big issues is that we certainly see it targeted less, and therefore we have a lot less to work off of. But one of the even bigger issues is the fact that all the commands the attacker could ever need exist on the system already. Essentially, all the attacker has to do is pull down a backdoor, and everything else should already exist. On Windows, this is starting to become the thing also, to live off the land. It's been going on for a bit, especially with the uprise of PowerShell and whatnot. But on Linux and on Mac, this has been the case for a long time. You have TCP tools that are built in. You have scanners that are built in. You have curl, curl and wget, which lets you just pull down additional tools should you want them. And service scanners. There's just all kinds of stuff already built in. There's very little need to pull a full hacker's tool set down to the system. So, and naturally, since those tools already exist on the system, admins and developers are using those as well. So when you're looking at command activity and stuff like that, you have to be able to determine the difference between an admin and an adversary, which oftentimes they can look like one and the same. Backdoors can be written in many different languages, so for instance, if you have a malicious bash script or a malicious Python script, static indicators or hashes aren't that useful, right? It takes the changing of one single character and the entire hash changes. So that makes it a lot more difficult. Nothing has to be recompiled. It's almost pointless to go off static indicators for scripts. And then naturally, the malware sample size is incredibly small compared to the size of Windows. But we are beginning to see more Mac malware, and so static indicators are still relevant on Mac, especially as these new backdoors continue to come out. So these are some of the attacker techniques I'm going to cover today. These are just different parts of the kill chain, essentially, but brought with a Mac spin on them. Essentially what we saw was an attacker come in with pre-compromised credentials with SSH. Through SSH, they basically got access to a user account that existed on multiple systems, and this user was also an admin. So moving about the network was relatively easy. He made it to a series of different computers before he was stopped. So in the recon phase, we saw a handful of different commands. Actually, we saw a lot of commands. I'll just touch on a few because recon's not that interesting. The most interesting probably being the first three commands you see here. So the swvers, this is going to give you an idea of what version of the operating system is running. Just some additional details. It's really short, spits back like 3 lines. Just gives you an idea of what's running. System profiler, this gives you low-level hardware details, actually a whole lot of details, a number of cores, etc., that type of thing. And then dscl.list users, this is the equivalent of like catting the etc password file and looking at the users. So it just spits back a big list of users on the system, as well as removing all the extra etc password stuff for you. So you get the users and the service users. So these first three commands I kind of point out because they are Mac specific. So when the actor comes in, he runs these commands early on. He comes in knowing he's going to run these commands, and that tells us that presumably he is not an attacker that was targeting a Linux box and ended up on a Mac box. Rather, he was specifically targeting a Mac box because he knew which commands to run once he got on the system. So. Mass amounts of ping usage, so you'll see this in any intrusion, but the attacker didn't script any ping usage or any type of scan usage out. He literally would just ping massive amounts of systems on the network, and he'd do that using the -C switch and a 1, which just says, ping it once, stop pinging it after that. Just let me know if it's up or not. This is the equivalent of the Windows -N1, I believe, so seeing that same behavior on Mac. Dig, lots of different host lookups and all that. Uname was run a large number of times. He's just kind of scraped the barrel of the basic recon commands that were run. DNS-SD, you're getting into something a little more interesting. If you don't know this one, check out the man page. It's kind of a replacement for the old MDNS commands that used to exist, but it lets you scan for a service, essentially, that's broadcasting. So the attacker would use this to see other SSH services that were broadcasting on the network. But like I said, check that out if you're not familiar with it, because it's not incredibly widely used, the command itself, but attackers are using it. So, backdoor installation. All right, so getting into some more interesting stuff here. So once the attacker would come on, he'd run a select few recon commands, and then he would install his backdoor manually. Almost everything the attacker did was manually, nothing scripted. The backdoor installation would start with a curl command, and this curl command would reach out to this web server that was hosting these tools at that IP address on port 8080, and it would pull down a Mach-O executable called TSSD. Just sitting right there on the root. When the attacker was done with hosting these tools, he'd bring his web server back down. But so he curls that backdoor down, he gives it executable permissions, he renames it to rutil, blends in a lot better than TSSD. And it's important to note that the attacker is actually working out of the user bin directory. So we now have this new backdoor sitting at user bin rutil. The touch command is then run on it. I'll get into what that's doing later. You might already be familiar with it. He then looks at the backdoor, sees that it's good. Vim's a file called etsy.cache, and this is actually a backdoor configuration file where the C2 and the port are held. Finally, he changes the permissions on it. So this IP address that you see the attacker pulling down from has been in previous reports from Blue Coat and ProtectWise. It's a known bad IP, but the funny thing is that it goes back quite a few years, so it's been around a while, and the attacker appears to still be using it. It's been attributed in the past to WinNTI group, which we call Wicked Panda at CrowdStrike, APT17, I believe, for the Mandiant folks. So this IP has been around a while and is still being used in fairly recent intrusions. Other backdoor curls. So the backdoor that the attacker pulled down on that first slide was not the only backdoor. There were 3 in total that we saw, all being hosted on the same IP address, and all having different hashes, being different samples. It seemed as though he would pull down the backdoor based on what version of the operating system he was on. However, I only got my hands on one of the executables, so I cannot say that for certain. It could have just been so that, to make hash identification more complicated. And I'll share the indicators of this at the end of my slides. I'll share all the different indicators that I'm going through. I know I'm kind of flying through them here. If you take one of these hashes, only one of them exists inside of VirusTotal. The other 2 are do not exist there, have never hit it. When we were originally investigating this, the backdoor didn't have any hits in VirusTotal. It came up as clean. As you can see, a lot of the different companies will identify this as kidnap, probably the most common word up there. Although I'm not a kidnap expert, it totally could be kidnap. But a lot of the traits that kidnap has, for instance, kidnap used a specific password dumping technique that we did not see the attacker use even when they had the opportunity. And kidnap was supposed to have that functionality built in. So it could be a variant of kidnap, maybe a modified version of it. I'm not entirely sure. What we were able to tell is that it seemed, and whether this is true for kidnap or not, for the sample we analyzed, it seemed like it was a modified version of Tiny Shell, which is a backdoor on Linux that you can easily find on GitHub. So curl all the things. So the curling didn't stop there. Any Mac intrusion, you tend to see a lot of curl activity, pulling down additional scripts, executables, whatever it be, despite the fact all the tools you should really need are on the operating system, like I mentioned. This actor was quite noisy, and they gave many different attempts to pull down a file called 5.txt, which was actually a shell script, as you can probably tell, as they tried to pipe it directly into bash. So curl would pull the contents of that text file down, and then they'd take the contents of that, pipe it directly into bash, which would keep keep the curl command from writing the script to the file system. You know, little more stealthy than actually writing to the file system and executing it. So as you can see, there's probably some type of encoding issue through whatever shell they were using or whatever the issue was. They had to run this multiple times, trying different %20s, X7s. There's some funny stuff in here. I like it when the bad guys screw up, so I include that in my talks. We have also seen this technique done, not in the APT world, but in the cybercrime world. We've seen this technique done where the actor will actually, instead of pulling down like a text file, he'll pull down a PNG file that's hosted publicly somewhere out on the web. And then inside that PNG file will be a bash script. That's if you were to look in a hex editor, you see it inside that PNG file somewhere. So the attacker curls the PNG file. He'll DD to the offset where the bash script exists. He'll pull that out and he'll pipe it directly into bash or Python or whatever language you want to write your malicious activity in. So this looks a little stealthier because it's just communication with pretty common photo hosting websites. Additional fails. So there were some times where we saw the attacker show some negligence on Mac OS, and this was surprising to me because you'll see the attacker is actually, he's knowledgeable. As I get further into some slides, you'll see what I'm talking about. But so if you've ever pen tested a Mac before, you probably know that the -E switch does not exist in the netcat listener. So you can't, generally this allows you, like when the connection's made, you can have that executable run, and this in theory would give you a shell over a remote connection. So Mac uses the BSD version of netcat, which does not have that built in, and it was surprising to see the attacker didn't seem to be aware of that. He tries multiple different attempts to use that -E switch to gain shell back to his backdoor on port 53, or back to the tool server on port 53, and with what I'm guessing is no luck. Otherwise, why would he keep trying these commands? So finally, he gives up and he pulls down his own version of netcat from the web server, and he uses that instead. The make node command, that's there, second from the bottom. So here the attacker is trying to create a file at temp p. And then you see the extra P there, that's specifying a PTY item, which he's then going to try and use over telnet. The PTY switch does not exist in the make node command on Mac. That's going to be more of a Linux thing. So this is just a screenshot on one of the systems the attacker managed to get onto. He renamed his backdoor PRL monitor instead of rutil like we saw earlier. Like I said, I'll give a list of indicators later so you can see all the different names that the attacker actually called this backdoor. But they would load it up, and that PRL monitor would talk to a C2 on port 53. And the C2 is actually the same IP address as the servers, or as the tools were being hosted on. This is an interesting choice. It can be done. There's nothing stopping you, but generally you use two different IPs, one for hosting a server, or one for hosting your tools, and one as your C2. The attacker in this case is using this IP that's been documented for quite some time as both. So persistence. So after you install your backdoor, you want it to run at every startup. Every time the system restarts, you want to maintain persistence. So since the attacker would install the backdoor on every system, he had a couple different ways of installing persistence where he went. So just a quick recap, standard ASAPs, if you're not familiar with this. So your standard persistence locations are going to be first at the system integrity protection level. So this is, if you're familiar with rootless, this is a location that only Apple should be able to write to, and that's at system library launch daemons or launch agents. So even root, even as the root user, you are not able to write to that directory if system integrity protection is enabled. At the root level, if you do have root access, generally we've seen malware install persistence mechanism into library launch daemons and library launch agents. This is probably, I would guess, the most common approach for Mac malware. Finally, there's the user level. Where at the user's home directory inside library launch daemons, that's where if you had only user permissions and you didn't care about getting root, you'd put your persistence mechanism there. You know, for a backdoor, you don't per se need root access. You can get access to all the documents you want just sitting in the user level. The odds of anyone finding you aren't that great. But root allows you to access all the files on the system, so documents for all users, as well as it allows you to bury into the operating system a little more and hide your stuff better. So there are also some basic schedulers like cron and periodic. Cron used for older like Linux malware. It's been used a couple times in Mac malware. But periodic is another one that I haven't actually seen used yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if it shows up pretty soon. So these, the root level, like I said, is basically where we see the majority of Mac malware installing to. If you guys are familiar with tools like BlockBlock from Objective-C, it actually just monitors your these types of locations. There's a lot of them on the system that are actually monitored, and every time your new software installs this location or updates, you get a little pop-up that says block or allow. This is an incredibly effective approach, at least if you know what you're doing. To a basic user, it might not mean anything, someone who's not technical, but knowing what software is installing persistence is just a great way of keeping tabs on things. And it's a very simple approach, but monitoring your persistence items is a great idea on Mac, and it's a great way to catch malware before it gets too far. So what did the attacker do? The attacker, once again, manually would set up persistence using Vim. He would create a file called com.apple.accessprinter.plist, and he would throw that in the library launch daemons directory on the majority of systems. He would then load that launch daemon, which kicks off the backdoor, and everything starts working. And then at next restart, he should be set to go. So this was really basic, but we also saw some other techniques. There is, however, in this slide, one red flag that sticks out, and that's the fact that a com.apple labeled file is sitting inside the library launch daemons directory, when almost all com.apple files should be sitting inside the system library launch daemons directory. So every now and then you'll see this. There could be a legitimate com.apple file in this directory, but if you see it, just check it out, see what it points at, because it could be something interesting, or it could be something that should probably be Apple signed or something like that, but you should not see too many of them. More than just a version check, this is where it got a little more interesting. So on not every system, the attacker would use the same persistence mechanism. On one system in particular, when he got in, he installed the backdoor, and he would test to see if he can write a file to the user bin directory. The user bin directory is also protected by system integrity protection. Here in this screenshot, you see me try to touch a quick file to user bin. I enter the right password, and it says operation not permitted. So still, root should not be able, only Apple should be able to add to this directory. You then see the attacker remove the X file that he created, implying that he actually did write it successfully. So when I saw this, I got pretty excited. I was like, all right, system integrity protection exploit. This is going to be sweet, big news. But you see the attacker run some recon commands after that because he looks kind of baffled that he can write to it also. And as it turns out, this is a Yosemite machine. It's old, and system integrity protection was enabled. And the next step up, which is El Capitan. So the reason he can do that is because the operating system was outdated. But he takes advantage of that. So again, showing knowledge of what he's actually doing, he goes and he takes that persistence mechanism that he would normally put in the library launch daemons directory, and he puts it inside of the system library launch daemons directory. Inside this directory, com.apple is going to look like a needle in a haystack. There's a ton of com.apple persistence mechanisms in there, and the attacker just blends in perfect with it now. So again, seeing a hole in terms of the lower level security on the operating system, when he sees that hole, he takes advantage of it. So showing through the netcat screw ups earlier, I don't know if the intern took over or whatever, but when we come to this, it looks like the attacker actually does know what he's doing a bit more. Touches it with -R again. Again, I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a bit, and then he loads it up with the launch control load command to kick off the backdoor. Persistence piggybacking is kind of a term I made up because I don't really know what else to call it. The last persistence type that we saw was the attacker would read the different login hooks that were on the system. So you can do this by reading the com.apple.login window.plist, and it comes back, Jamf is installed on this system. Like I said, you'll see third-party administrative software on a lot of systems. So he reads that and sees that Jamf is installed, and the next command we see is actually the attacker vimming that Jamf login hook. I don't have a modified version of what the attacker did. This is the Jamf login hook without any modifications made to it, but the fact that we saw the attacker vimming the file is a pretty good indication that he's just adding his backdoor there and living off the land by letting persistence that already exists on the system kick off his backdoor. And this is definitely stealthier than creating your own launch daemon. So. Cleanup. So the attacker wasn't overly concerned with cleanup. As you see, he was pretty loud. Even some of the commands that I've shown you, they've just been short little snippets of all the commands that were actually executed. There was a whole lot of them. What they did do, they would remove files. When they pulled down files and they were done with those files, they did a pretty good job of removing them. They did a pretty good job of trying not to leave anything on the file system, just sitting in the random directories they used. Apple did used to have a binary built in called SRM, which was a secure remove executable. This no longer exists. I can't remember what operating system or which version I saw it disappear on, but at least that's not available anymore, unless it's been merged into another command that I'm just not familiar with, which is totally possible. So the attackers were then, we come to this touch command that you've seen on multiple different slides at this point. This is a popular technique. If you've looked into Linux pen testing, you may have seen it. Attackers are using this touch-R command. In the majority of Unix-based intrusions, this command always pops up. So that's worth noting. But what this command does is it takes the timestamps of one file and applies those timestamps to another file. So the first command there, you see touch R2util. R2util is a legitimate binary that exists on the Mac OS operating system by default. So he takes the timestamps from that binary and he applies it to his backdoor. Likely he does the same with etc profile, and he applies that to his backdoor configuration file. And then for his persistence, he takes the timestamps of the Cisco AnyConnect plist that he sees running on the operating system, and he applies that to his plist. So, like I said, this is a pretty popular technique you can find if you're looking around online. It does make traditional timeline-based forensics a little bit more difficult if you're looking at the file file timestamps for your forensics approach. It does scatter it about. The good news is that on Mac it just changes the access and modification times. It doesn't change the change time. On Linux, it changes all the timestamps. So on Mac, it's just a couple, or at least on some flavors of Linux. So yeah, we see that command in many different Unix-based intrusions. So it's something worth looking out for. It does seem like built-in anti-forensics. Why would you even want this command? But one legitimate reason, and we see it used legitimately too. Don't get me wrong. This comes back to finding that happy medium between admin usage and attacker usage, and in what ways do they look different, which makes detection so complex. But some compilers, for example, will complain if one of your files is more outdated than your other code, in which case you take the touch command here and you'd update your timestamps on your file to so that the compiler will stop complaining. So that's one legitimate use case of probably many that just don't come to my head because I just see anti-forensics built in. Finally, not really a cleanup technique, but a decent stealth approach that we've seen used multiple times. The attacker will SSH into a system, and they'll supply the -O switch, which allows you to specify basically different SSH configurations at the command line level. So in this case, he's saying, don't use a known host file. The known host file being the file that, when you SSH into a new system, you get a pop-up that says, hey, you're SSHing into a new system. You want to add this key to your known host, etc. The attacker's saying, don't log any of that. Just throw it in dev null, let it be blown away. Not really a cleanup technique again, but still a wise technique and fairly identifiable on the command line level. Lateral movement. So it probably comes as no surprise that on like a Mac OS environment, this environment was primarily Mac OS. There were a number of different servers running inside the network. So pretty much running SSH at all times. So it should come as no surprise that SSH is the go-to lateral movement tool on both Linux and Mac. For any developers that might also be running on the network, there's a chance that they'd have SSH enabled too, and that's another possibility, another possible entry point to get onto personal systems instead of servers. So we see a lot of the common techniques, attackers grepping for SSH usage inside the bash history. This just gives an idea of what systems the attacker has, or what systems the legitimate user has access to, where credentials may work freely. So if you get onto this box and then SSH into a new box with the same credentials, that's an easy win. Same goes for the known host file. Attackers checking the known host file, just seeing what systems have been SSH'd into. We saw some port forwarding and some other configuration being applied. So the attacker from their tools server would pull down a RS file, and this RS file you actually see being used in the next command where the capital F is applied and then RS. So this is just a SSH configuration file. So rather than supplying all the command line items, supplying all the options at the command line, they would load in a personal configuration file for how they wanted SSH to work. This is actually just a quick screenshot where the attacker would come in through SSH. You can see, and then bash would spawn. There's 3 to 7 seconds between when the sudo command was run and when a new shell would be created. This just presumably gives you an idea that the attacker knows the sudo password. On some systems, it would take 3 seconds to log in or to create a shell. On some systems, it would take 5 seconds to create a shell. On some, it would take 7. That's right about the right amount of time to enter a password. So I just show this. Obviously, you probably have logs if you're doing forensics, but if you only have process timestamps, even based on those process timestamps, you can probably come to the conclusion that the attacker knew the password to escalate to root. PTY and TTY. So in some cases, when the attacker was moving around, he'd be through some crummy TCP connection tool that did not have a PTY associated with it. If you're not familiar with PTYs or TTYs, a very quick sum up and rough sum up would be, think of it as a fully interactive shell. So the PTY gives you that capability to kind of communicate with your executables. For instance, think the pseudo binary. When you type in sudo and you try to escalate, it comes back, it asks you for a password, you enter that password, and now you're root. If you don't have that PTY, when it comes back to ask for your password, it's just going to hang because it doesn't know how to communicate with you over that remote connection. It doesn't know how to go like with a back and forth with your executable because there's no PTY. That's a very quick sum up. What the attacker would do in such an instance is he would run some base 64 encoded Python. One of the reasons I bring this up is because this has become so popular on Windows PowerShell with encoded commands. This is basically the equivalent of what we've been seeing on Mac OS. The command that actually ends up getting decrypted and run is the import pty spawn bin bash. Again, really popular on different pen testing communities. If you Google how to get a PTY over a netcat listener, this is probably one of the first commands that will come up. But any command or any interpreter language that has base 64 libraries could run this command. So you're dealing with more than just one scripting language. But I do bet, we see a lot of Python with attackers. So I do bet we'll see a lot more of this in the future. Okay, exploits in the real world. The last screenshot I got here I want to share with you because I think it's pretty cool, and there's probably a good chance you haven't seen it before. You don't need to be a forensic expert, really, to identify why it's probably malicious. But I'll start at the bottom of the tree here. So at the bottom of the tree, we actually see these commands being run: dscl, defaults, tr, plutil. These are common commands that get run and piped to each other when passwords are being dumped on Mac OS. Defaults can read the password file of the user. And then tr can be used to convert hex, and then plutil can be used to convert from the binary information to XML. So you ultimately end up with this outcome of like a hash, a salt, or sorry, you get data, you get entropy, you get salt. You can, and if you know how, you can bring all these together to create a hash. There's a lot of tools out there that'll do it for you, and it's easy to find online also, just how to dump passwords on Mac. At the bottom of this tree, we see passwords being dumped nearly for every user. So this is actually, this process tree is interactive, but all I have is a screenshot to work with. So normally you can click on these, you'll see the command line that was used, you'll see the full path of the binaries, but I only have a screenshot to work with here, so I apologize. But I'll still walk you through what else happened here. So passwords being dumped at the very bottom, that's the first red flag. A lot of files do access the file that holds user password information, so a lot of binaries will access that. So just because that happens doesn't mean you can assume that something malicious occurred. But in this case, once again, like I mentioned, the process tree gives us additional context into what happened. So if we take that up another level, we see a 8-letter process that looks randomly named. This process is actually running out of the temp directory. Again, looking really shady, not something we want to see. So red flag number 1, passwords being dumped. Red flag number 2, from a process inside the temp directory. Take that up one more step, and we have a 4-letter process that is also running out of the temp directory. So passwords dumped, temp directory. Finally, the final red flag, and this should be pretty obvious, is the fact this is all coming under the Google Chrome process. Not just the Google Chrome process, but the Google Chrome helper process, which is the browser renderer process. Should potentially never be creating any children, let alone children out of the temp directory. So this was actually a 0-day we found running in the wild. This was some time ago at this point, but it does show that attackers are specifically attacking Mac OS. There's reason to believe that inside some of the different some of the command lines gave us reason to believe that this was designed for Mac OS, and the attackers were using it to phish, to get users to go to links, and then where this exploit would then occur. So pretty interesting stuff to see. And if you do have if you do have a friend or you're one of those people that believes Macs are never targeted, hopefully at least this screenshot, if anything, can change your mind. Static indicators, so there's the 3 different hashes of the backdoor. I'll give you a link so you guys can access these, but those are the 3 different hashes, the IP or the C2, all the different file names we saw the attacker rename their executable to, and then the different positions of the launch daemons, just something to take home. Nothing major, and we may never see those again, but they're there for you. So. You can follow me at jbradley89 on Twitter. On GitHub, jbradley89 shakakon-yara will have those indicators for you just in the format of a Yara rule. Feel free to grab them. Yeah, that's all I have for you guys. So. Looks like I got time for questions if there are any. Cool. All right. Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate being here.